In the entire history of American politics, there are very few moments when Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and the CEO of a major Silicon Valley tech giant all actually agree on something. But this week, that literally just happened. Senator Bernie Sanders introduced legislation to seize 50% of the stock from OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI. And we're talking forcibly, right through a one-time tax. He wants to take that stock and drop it into a public fund that would give every single American a direct payment. Think about that, every American getting a check straight from AI profits.
And then you have Donald Trump, who, by the way, has spent his second term really championing AI deregulation, coming out publicly and saying the U.S. government should take direct equity stakes in AI companies. He literally called it a beautiful thing. He talked about making the public a partner in this revolution. And if that wasn't wild enough, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, the guy worth billions from the exact company Sanders wants to seize, well, he privately met with Bernie Sanders to tell him that he agrees. He also wants the public to have equity in these companies. It's crazy. Three people who agree on almost nothing are suddenly agreeing on this. So, what does this actually mean for us? Who benefits? Who loses out? And is this the exact moment AI becomes the most politically explosive issue in America? Let's figure this out together.
Section 1. The Economic Breaking Point. Why June 2026? To really get why this political moment arrived right now in June 2026, we have to look at the economic backdrop. It's intense. Tech layoffs in 2026 have already blown past 142,000. Meta cut 8,000 people in a single morning, all while reporting record profits. Intuit cut 3,000 that exact same day. Microsoft slashed 15,000 jobs. Amazon is currently cutting 30,000. Basically, every major tech company is simultaneously reporting record-breaking earnings while slashing their headcount. And the explicit reason they're giving? It's AI.
But here's the kicker. At the exact same time, the combined AI infrastructure buildout planned by these major tech companies for 2026 is a staggering $700 billion. Let me put that in perspective. The companies cutting all those workers are taking their payroll savings and investing them directly into the very technology that's replacing those workers. Just let that sink in for a second. The political fallout was completely inevitable. Workers are losing their livelihoods while the companies eliminating those jobs are just skyrocketing in value. A tiny, tiny fraction of investors and executives are scooping up essentially all of that value. And the public? The people whose tax dollars funded the universities that trained the researchers, whose personal data actually trained these AI models, and whose spending drives the entire economy, we're getting absolutely nothing.
Bernie Sanders hit the nail on the head. He said AI is built on a public resource far more valuable than oil. So will the Trump White House follow through on the logic of its move into the private sector and agree with Bernie Sanders? Now that quote hints at something absolutely crucial that flew under the radar back in August 2025. It set the precedent for this whole situation. The U.S. government actually converted $11.1 billion in CHIPS Act funds into a 10% non-voting stake in Intel Corporation. That's 433 million shares. It was literally the first time our government ever took an equity stake in a major tech company. So the principle, it's already established. The government can own shares in tech companies. The big question now is, should they do the exact same thing with AI?
All right, Section 2, the mandatory stock seizure, Sanders Wealth Fund. So Sanders' proposal is, without a doubt, the most aggressive one on the table right now. The core mechanism here is a one-time tax, but get this, it's paid in shares, not cash. Basically, any company crossing $200 million in annual AI revenue would be forced to transfer 50% of its stock into a brand new, federally managed fund. No cash actually changes hands. The companies just hand over equity. Sanders estimates this fund will be worth around $7 trillion based on current valuations. $7 trillion, all in shares, owned by the federal government on behalf of everyday Americans. And who oversees this massive pot of wealth? An independent 7-person commission nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And here's the wild part. That commission would hold the fund's voting shares. That means the U.S. government would have actual board seats and real voting power at OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI. And the result for us? Every American would receive direct payments from the fund's returns. We're talking a physical check distributed every year, funded entirely by AI profits. Sanders kind of likens it to the Alaska Permanent Fund, the one that hands out oil revenue to every Alaskan resident annually. On top of that, Sanders actually called for breaking up OpenAI entirely. He's the first major Democratic politician to throw around serious antitrust language specifically targeted at an AI company. He told Axios, "We need to take a deep breath and understand it's like a meteor coming. We've got to be prepared to deal with all of its complexity." So what Sanders is proposing is basically a partial nationalization of the AI industry. Now, it's not some Soviet-style total government takeover, but it is a mandatory 50% equity seizure enforced right through the tax code. And his argument is super populist, right? He's saying it was the public's data, the public's tax dollars, and the public's universities that built this tech, so the public should own half of it.
Moving on to Section 3. The Trump and Altman pivot. A surprising agreement.
Facing a ton of pressure from a working-class base that's really feeling the heat from AI, Donald Trump actually shifted his stance. On June 5th, he told reporters that the U.S. government might just take direct equity stakes in these companies. But he framed it more like a team-up, saying, you make them a partnership in this revolution, it would be a beautiful thing. Now, Trump's version of government ownership is structurally way different from Sanders. Trump is talking about voluntary equity donations, so companies choosing to give shares to the government rather than having them forcibly seized. And interestingly enough, OpenAI proposed something super similar in an April 2026 policy paper. They pitched a public wealth fund seeded by voluntary equity donations, aiming for about 1 to 5% of OpenAI's shares. Just to put that into perspective, at OpenAI's current valuation of around $852 billion, a mere 1% donation is over $8.5 billion. So yeah, the gap between the two ideas is massive. A voluntary 1% versus a mandatory 50%. But the absolutely remarkable thing here? The overall direction is exactly the same. Suddenly, across the whole political spectrum, the debate isn't should the government be involved in AI anymore. It's how much of AI should the government actually own.
And then there's the biggest wild card in all of this, Sam Altman himself. After Sanders announced his bill, Altman privately asked to meet with the senator. He literally went to Capitol Hill and told Bernie Sanders that he actually agrees. He wants the public to have equity in AI companies too. Guys, this is no small thing. Altman runs the company valued at $852 billion. A 50% seizure at that valuation, that would transfer roughly $426 billion in OpenAI stock straight to the federal government. So for him to agree with the general concept, even if he's obviously not thrilled about that specific 50% number, is just a masterclass in political positioning. So why on earth would Altman do this? Well, there's the cynical view. Altman sees the writing on the wall. The political momentum is shifting fast against him. I mean, 142,000 layoffs, record profits, and a $700 billion infrastructure build-out while everyday workers get displaced, that's a story that writes itself against the AI industry. Getting ahead of the narrative, framing OpenAI as the good guys who want to share the wealth voluntarily rather than the greedy corp that needs its assets seized, well, that's just way better politics than fighting Sanders in a Senate hearing. But there's also the charitable view. Maybe Altman genuinely believes that hoarding all this AI wealth among a few companies and investors is a real problem. He's said publicly multiple times that he wants AI's benefits to be broadly shared, and he's even called for a public wealth vehicle before. So the Sanders meeting totally tracks with that. Plus, Dario Amodei over at Anthropic has hinted at something similar. In his essay, Machines of Love and Grace, he mentioned that taxes on AI companies could actually fund universal basic income. Regardless, Sanders isn't having it. He drew a hard line, saying, I think people like Sam Altman and Trump may be sympathetic to this or saying, okay, look, we're making zillions of dollars, so we're going to be nice guys and maybe we'll buy off the public. That's not good enough. Seriously, the politics here are moving faster than anyone expected.
Let's get into Section 4. The trillion-dollar debate. The cases for and against.
Okay, so let's break down the honest case for the government stepping in. First off, the public basically subsidized the entire AI revolution. Decades of foundational AI research were funded by DARPA, the NSF, and university grants. The internet itself, which is literally the data pipeline for all of this, was a public infrastructure project. And those brilliant researchers, they were trained at universities funded by public money. So the idea that private companies should just pocket 100% of the returns on all that public investment, it's a pretty contestable point. And then you have to look at the scale of job displacement. It is incredibly real. 142,000 layoffs in just 5 months. Employment for software developers under 26 is down 20%. Wall Street is actually planning to cut 200,000 jobs. If AI keeps replacing workers like this while all the profits pool in a small number of companies, the political fallout is going to be severe. Redistributing wealth through equity ownership is one mechanism to try and address that. Plus, we have the Norway precedent. Norway's government pension fund, which is built entirely on oil revenue, is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world at $1.7 trillion. It owns about 1.5% of all publicly listed companies globally. And it was built on a very simple principle. A massive natural resource windfall should belong to the whole country. Alaska has been doing the exact same thing with oil for decades. So arguing that AI profits should be distributed the same way, it's really not that radical economically.
But on the flip side, here is the case against it. Sanders' plan is basically straight-up nationalization. A mandatory 50% equity seizure enforced via taxes isn't just a wealth fund.
It is a massive warning sign to every future AI entrepreneur. It says the government will take half your company if you build something important. The chilling effect that could have on innovation could be incredibly significant, and the US would be the only major economy doing this, while China just keeps building AI with zero constraints. Then you've got the governance risks. Who actually controls those voting shares? If a 7-person government commission suddenly gets board seats at OpenAI, who appoints them? What are their incentives? What kind of decisions are they going to make? Historically, government-managed industrial stakes haven't exactly had a flawless track record. Alternatively, the voluntary approach might just work without all that coercion. OpenAI's own proposal of donating 1% to 5% of shares would still create a massively meaningful public fund without seizing assets. At an $852 billion valuation, 5% is over $42 billion. That's real money for a real fund, achieved without the chilling effect of a forced 50% tax. Finally, the market has already reacted. Tech stocks sold off heavily in early June when these equity stake discussions went public. Markets are pricing in the uncertainty, the dilution of shares, government control, the operational strings attached to public ownership. That cost is entirely real.
Section 5. What this means globally. The world is watching.
Now, the United States definitely isn't the only country having this conversation. Over in France, President Macron just locked down commitments from SoftBank and OpenAI to build out AI infrastructure. This makes France the single largest destination for new AI data center investments outside the US in 2026. They're positioning themselves as an AI hub by attracting investment, not by demanding ownership. Meanwhile, the EU's AI Act, which is already in force, is taking a purely regulatory approach. They're focused on transparency, safety testing, and human oversight mandates. Then you look at China. Their approach is controlling at the source. The government already has direct state control and massive influence over all major Chinese AI companies through regulatory and party structures. You don't really need a sovereign wealth fund when the state is already shaping corporate decisions directly. And look at the G7 AI working lunch in Evian this past June. They brought together the heads of OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and Mistral alongside world leaders for the very first time at this level. The agenda? AI governance, AI safety, and exactly how to handle the economic distribution of AI gains. So these exact same questions are being debated in every capital simultaneously. But what the US decides about AI ownership, that's going to set the precedent. Think about it. America's approach to the internet, light regulation, private ownership, global expansion, literally shaped the entire world's digital economy. Whatever America decides to do with AI ownership is going to have that exact same reach.
And finally, Section 6. Who controls the future?
All right, let's get a realistic assessment of where this goes next. Sanders' 50% mandatory seizure bill, it's not going to pass in its current form. The Senate arithmetic just does not exist for it. Republicans will not vote for mandatory nationalization, and enough Democrats will have concerns about crushing innovation to block it. But here's the thing, the bill doesn't need to pass to matter. It shifts the Overton window, the range of politically acceptable ideas. Just a year ago, saying the government should own AI companies was a total fringe position. Today, it is being endorsed by the sitting president from the opposite party. So the most likely outcome here is a negotiated middle ground. We're probably looking at voluntary equity donations of 1% to 5% from major AI companies, structured as a public wealth fund, administered by an independent body with distributions to American citizens. This gives Altman the political cover he absolutely needs. It gives Trump the populist story he wants, and it gives Sanders partial credit for moving the conversation. Whether that fund ends up being large enough to actually matter, and whether the checks are meaningful relative to the AI-driven economic disruption they're meant to offset, well, that's a genuinely open question.
But the deeper question is the one Sanders is actually raising. AI is not like a previous technology. Its economic impact isn't measured in one industry or just one job category. It is being measured across the entire economy simultaneously. The institutions we built to manage past technological transitions, things like unions, unemployment insurance, retraining programs, they simply were not built for this kind of speed or this scale. The conversation about who owns AI is really a conversation about who controls the future economy. And that conversation is now totally mainstream, whether the legislation passes or not.
Before you go, I want to leave you with one question to sit with. If every American received an annual payment from an AI sovereign wealth fund, would you want that? Even if it meant the government had voting rights on OpenAI's board. That trade-off, economic participation in exchange for government influence over AI decisions, is the actual choice being debated right now, not in theory, in the US Senate, in the White House, in private meetings between Silicon Valley CEOs and socialist senators. The AI revolution is generating enormous wealth. The question of who that wealth belongs to is now a political question, not just an economic one. I am your host. This is The Explainer, the most important tools shaping the world in plain English every week. Please subscribe, like this explainer, and drop in the comments, should the government own a piece of OpenAI? Yes or no, and why?
See you in the next one.